Good morning, everybody. Nice to see everybody virtually. We're excited to get kicked off with this webinar in just a minute here as the participants are able to enter the room. Okay, looks like we're hitting a critical mass. Well, welcome and thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Envisioning a New Critical Minerals Trade Policy Amid a Trade War. Lots of exciting developments, so this is very timely. We're very excited today to share the results of our Silverado team's months-long research that has culminated in 2 groundbreaking papers on critical mineral supply chain security. We have people joining the webinar from all over the world, various different governments, and a lot of thought leaders and private sector. So I think that we'll have a great education webinar today, as well as Q&A at the end. My name is Sarah Stewart. I'm the CEO of Silverado, and I am joined today by my very esteemed and accomplished colleagues, Manaz Khan, our VP of Critical Supply Chains, Andy David, our VP for Research and Analysis, and David Kelm, who's our policy analyst focused on critical minerals. For many of you, you've probably worked with us, but for those who don't know who Silverado is, we are a nonpartisan geopolitical think tank focused on accelerating bipartisan solutions to pressing challenges. And we work in 4 main areas: national security, trade and industrial security, cybersecurity, and what we call EcoSec, which is the intersection of ecological and economic security. We've been at the forefront of research and policy with respect to critical minerals for several years now. And as we enter a new era with a new administration and a new Congress that are focused on this issue, we are excited to think creatively about how to create more resiliency in these supply chains and how to avoid the risks associated with choke points. Our approach is data-driven, informed by discussions that we've had with the private sector, many thought leaders, many of you on this call. And what we're hoping for is to provide you with very granular, actionable recommendations to advance policy. We hope that you will learn a lot today and also check out the papers that we've done on this topic that are on our website, www.silverado.org. We will leave time at the end for Q&A, so please do use the Q&A function. We want to hear from you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Manaz.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is, as Sarah said, my name is Manaz, and today we're going to walk through our webinar agenda with you. And it is in 4 very simple parts. First, we'll walk through the threat. And this is what Silverado considers the most immediate threat for our defense supply chains. These are strategic defense critical minerals. We'll walk through the methodology of how we came to this grouping. We just want to caveat that we love all our critical minerals here at Silverado equally, but we decided to prioritize using this list. Next, we will go through the problem. Anybody that's in this space knows that China's grip on critical minerals is a very big issue. You can't say critical minerals in the same sentence without saying China, so we'll walk through what this means. And we'll also look at the downstream implications. The first is the tit-for-tat war on the semiconductor supply chain. And then next, we'll also go through we'll go through critical minerals that affect the broader defense supply chain. So 2 critical minerals here that get overlooked, which are tantalum and tungsten. Next, we will pivot over to the rare earths industry and show you what is going on in the history of rare earths, because it has been used as a bargaining chip in the last administration and previously over the last 15 years. Last, we'll give you our solution, which is a trade policy solution, which Sarah discussed And this is a solution of many, but one that we developed at Silverado, given that we're the trade experts, and it's called the Mineral Security Trade Policy Framework, or for short, the MINSEC framework. And last, I will pass it over to David for questions. So if you want to put those in the chat as I'm talking, feel free to do that as the webinar proceeds. So moving over to the threat, as I stated before, the threat we really see as strategic defense critical minerals. And I came into this job about a year ago, not knowing what a critical mineral was. And so we did this type of analysis where we saw that there was three different critical minerals, three different lists of critical minerals. It included the Department of Defense list, the USGS list, and the Department of Energy list. So we asked ourselves here at Silverado, which ones are the ones that are most pressing for the national security and defense, and which ones do we have the most exposure risk? And we love data here at Silverado, so we decided to conduct a data-driven exercise. And so I want to walk you very quickly through that methodology. What we did is we first started with the DoD list, the strategic materials list, and then we cross-referenced it with the USGS list. So there's about 50 critical minerals or so on the DoD list. And then when we cross-referenced it, we got about 35. And then we again cross-referenced this with the DOE list. And then what we did is we develop this proprietary threat index. We looked at the US net import reliance overall for this critical mineral, and then dug down deeper and looked at our net import reliance on foreign entities of concern, mainly China and Russia. Then what we did is we took another factor into account, which is the global share of mining and processing. And we gave different weights to these critical minerals, and we developed this threat index. So every single critical mineral got a threat level. And we had a cutoff, and what emerged from this list is our list of strategic defense critical minerals. And that's about 12 of them. So you can see from this chart, we mapped out all the net import reliance, all the three factors here, and we have a number of critical minerals, and that includes arsenic, gallium, indium, natural graphite, tantalum, bismuth, antimony, germanium, tungsten, as well as rare earths. We had separate breakouts for scandium and yttrium. We know that these are rare earths, but they are broken out in the USGS, so we broke them out as well. What is interesting about this chart is that there is these minerals, about 11 of the 12 of them, are on China's dual-use export control list. 3 of them already have export bans on them. So there's one missing, we won't tell China, but that is arsenic. We are 100% net import reliant on this mineral, and we are getting 93% of our imports of arsenic metal directly from China. So a huge exposure risk, but one that China hasn't put export control on yet. So if we're looking at these minerals from China's vantage point and looking at it from China to the US, what happens is we see a really scary picture. And if we envision ourselves as a dartboard, we see that there are a number of darts here that China has already hit us with. You can see that the green dots are export restrictions. So that is anything short of an export control. That could be a traceability system that's in place, additional documentation, or another sort of restriction. You can see most of this dartboard has red dots. And again, that's the 11 of the 12 of strategic defense critical minerals that are on that export control list. You can see the black dots are an export ban. So that happened in December. That's antimony, gallium, and germanium. And there is also, the yellow dot is the export control on processing technology. Right now that's on rare earths, and that includes yttrium and scandium. So that's our positioning at the moment for just strategic defense critical minerals. We do want to, and we cannot overstate this enough, that all the critical minerals are important. They're different parts of the supply chain. Every single critical mineral has a different supply chain. So for example, lithium and cobalt also have issues with China. And this was elaborated in China's USTR's recent report on China's WTO compliance. And this is just generally what China does. They have become predatory, and they are looking to displace foreign competitors and dominated targeted industries. And we believe those targeted industries include critical minerals and downstream industries such as our defense industry, semiconductors, the battery supply chain, etc. So when we're looking at strategic defense critical minerals and we look at Trump's executive order on unleashing American energy that came out on his first day in office, the goal of this administration is to position the U.S. as a leading producer and processor of critical minerals, including rare earths, to strengthen our supply chains both with ourselves and our allies, and reduce the global influence on adversarial states, i.e. China. So we really think, if we're talking about in terms of prioritization, and prioritization of our defense needs, that should be, that strategic defense critical minerals should be looked at in the context of our defense needs and our import exposure risk. Next, moving on, I want to talk about China's grip on critical minerals. Now, this has been going on for some time, and I'll show you, this chart. There's a lot going on in this chart, but what I want you to take away from this chart is that wherever the United States has an action, you see China retaliating on the upstream part of the supply chain. So, for example, the United States in 2019 put export controls on semiconductors for one Chinese company, Huawei. We followed up in 2020 and then in 2022. Then you can see in the yellow column, the critical minerals column, that China did a series of retaliation measures on export controls of minerals, because that's where they dominate. We see first, not surprisingly, that China started off putting an export control on germanium and gallium. And that's not surprising, given that those are two semiconductor inputs that are key. Then there was another export control in October 2023 on graphite. We see just it following up with antimony, and then again, the 11 of 12 strategic defense critical minerals were put on the dual-use export control list in December, and then we get a ban on antimony, germanium, and gallium, which just affects the United States. So China did that on the critical mineral side. What was interesting is that they also went one step downstream and also put an export control on rare earth element processing and magnet technology. So we'll come back to that, but we really see that as the new frontier. So this just shows us where we hit on the the downstream part. China's hitting us on the upstream critical minerals. So what most people miss, there was a lot of talk in the policy circles back in the fall and back in December of export controls and export bans, but all that chatter kind of died down. But we kept our eye on the ball, and we have been tracking here at Silverado what's been happening since. So December 1st, China implements this new export control regime through their export control list of dual-use items. So that gives them a very strong position to retaliate very quickly. And they did. So the United States on December 2nd, the very next day, put an export control on advanced semiconductor technology. Overnight, what we see China doing, armed with this new, stronger export control regime, is that they placed export bans on germanium, gallium, and antimony, and then tighter restrictions on graphite. That's just shipped to the United States. So again, a very targeted action towards us. Then during the holidays, a lot of folks missed this. During the holidays, China did a series of actions. On December 27th, China sanctions several US defense companies. On January 2nd, there's 3 actions. They also added 28 US companies to their export list and 10 companies to the unreliable entity list. So again, all targeted towards the United States. On January 2nd, what was interesting that they did is they didn't put an export ban on lithium, gallium, and battery technologies. They just proposed it. So they're showing their cards to show that if we were to do something, that they would hit and put an export ban on our lithium and battery technologies, which would hit the US battery supply chain. and also on the gallium processing technologies, which may hurt our semiconductor production here at home. So this we consider a tease, but a real threat if we were to act. This is really the new frontier, is these export bans or controls on the processing technology side, not just the minerals, but also on the processing technology. Now, I want to drill down a little bit deeper on the downstream industries and really, we talked a little bit about semiconductors, but drill down on what the implications of critical minerals on the supply chain. So with respect to semiconductors, we know semiconductors are in every single, touches on a number of applications, including smartphones, computers, EVs, and critical defense systems. So very, very important. What's interesting is that the United States and China both have the same goal to dominate the semiconductor production. We have, in the United States, earmarked about $53 billion through the CHIPS and Science Act to get our semiconductor production here up and running and very competitive. China has the same goal. In its Made in 2025 initiative, it stated that it wanted to be 70% self-sufficient in semiconductor production in a few years, I believe by 2027. And they are on track to do that. We can see right now, we do know, as I stated before, that China dominates a lot of the semiconductor minerals in the upstream part, so gallium, germanium, rare earths, indium, tantalum, and arsenic. What most people don't know is that China also dominates in the fabrication side of the chip supply chain and the assembly, testing, and packaging. The US dominates on the design part of the supply chain. So that's where we really dominate. If we can take it one step further, China is looking to also dominate the foundational chip sector, or what folks call mature or legacy chips. So we need a foundational chip and an advanced chip to make a semiconductor. And China is moving in on this part of the supply chain as well. And China looks like they're going to be on track to dominate this part of the supply chain in general. So by 2027, we see that China will overtake Korea and Taiwan in leading on semiconductor production capacity. And so right now they're at 28% of global semiconductor production capacity, and they're on third to get about 1/3 of that. And you can see that reflected in the pie chart, and that's just in the next 2 years. We do acknowledge that USTR has opened up a 301 investigation on these foundational chips, and with an eye towards looking at how China is able to gain leverage and what tactics they are using. So for those that are in the semiconductor space, we urge you to, be involved in that investigation, because this already seems to be a scary picture in terms of how much of that supply chain they will control in just 2 years. Next, I want to pivot over to how China targets the broader US defense industry and talk about two critical minerals that we tend to overlook in this space, and that is tantalum and tungsten. So tantalum also has cross-cutting applications. That includes missile systems, semiconductor, night vision goggles, and jet engine components. Tungsten doesn't get talked about as much, but it's vital for ground vehicle armor, small arms ammunition, and armor-penetrating projectiles. So going over to tungsten, we are about 50% net import reliant on, and 27% of our imports come from China. You can see China's positioning in the supply chain. China dominates about 82% of total tungsten mine output for 2023. We also see that China dominates when we're looking at the number of processing plants that make tungsten. They have about 68%. And another foreign entity of concern, Russia, dominates about 8%. So they're tied with us, but the 3/4 of the market for tungsten processing plants are controlled by 2 foreign entities of concern. So that is a bit concerning from our end. We see for tantalum, the situation is different, but a little bit more dire. We are 100% net import reliant on tantalum, and we are getting about 40% of our supply from China. What's interesting about tantalum is that most of the tantalum mine output comes from African countries such as Congo, which makes about half, Rwanda, and Nigeria. China only accounts for 3.7% of tantalum mine production, but when we look below, we see that China accounts for close to half of the number of tantalum refineries and secondary plant production in the supply chain. So that is a stat that, we can see China just gaining the leverage on the processing side. We do acknowledge that USTR has put 25% tariffs on both tantalum and tungsten to move that supply chain. There's also a DFARS regulation that will go into, that will be extended to tantalum and tungsten, so that if these materials are used in the defense supply chain, they cannot be mined, separated, or processed in a country that is a foreign entity of concern. So we have to make sure that in the United States, we are working towards meeting that standard, and that our defense industry is ready to comply with that when it comes into effect in January 2027. Next, I will turn it over to one of our favorite minerals, which is rare earths. And rare earths has a very interesting history. And we're going to show you the positioning of rare earths at the moment, given all the dynamics that are involved. So just to start off, what are rare earths used for? Again, one of those cross-cutting minerals. They're used in semiconductors, consumer electronics, wind turbines, in our military defense systems, electric motor vehicles, and aerospace technologies. So very, very vital, very, very key. You can see here that China dominates both the mining and the refining of these minerals. So China accounts for close to 70% of the mining and about 90% of the refining. The US, we're second on the mining side, but you can see that we do not refine. We don't account for the global capacity of refining, although we think that will change now that companies like MP Materials have started making rare earth metals here in the United States. So hopefully in a few years, we'll see more of that yellow bar in the United States. Now, I want to walk you through the history of rare earths, and there's a lot here on this slide. But generally, the key takeaway is that rare earths have been used as a bargaining chip from China against the United States and against other allies for some time. This started in 2010 when China and Japan got into a maritime dispute and China reduced its rare earth exports. Then we get into a period between 2012 and 2015 where there was a challenge by the US, EU, and Japan on China's restrictions of rare earths at the WTO. And then 3 years later, China removed that. So that was kind of our WTO period. Then during the first Trump administration, we see, again, it used as a bargaining chip. The United States put Section 301 tariffs on US imports from China, excluding rare earth elements in 2019. And China retaliated by raising the tariffs on rare earths, both in the concentrated form and the refined form, as a result of our Section 301 tariffs. Then in 2020, there's a phase 1 agreement, and China commits to purchasing these raw rare earths. What most people don't know is while all this was going on, China was, within its own domestic industry, strengthening its control over its rare earths industry. And they approved the merger of 3 major rare earth companies. And then 2023, they implemented a new traceability system. They followed up by imposing export controls, like I said, on the processing side. And now these rare earths are on this dual use export control list. So it's been used a lot in the past. And if we were to impose tariffs or have other retaliatory measures, it wouldn't be surprising if rare earths again was used as a bargaining chip. So what's the solution? I've painted a kind of a scary picture in the semiconductor space and the defense space and in our own domestic industry. And we think here at Silverado, given that we're the trade experts, we're looking at this from our trade policy lens, and we're very excited to introduce the Mineral Security Trade Policy Framework. And this is really a groundbreaking framework where we think we can organize the government internally to react and to make alliances with our partners. The reality is that not every critical mineral is here in the United States. So we need to source from other countries. The other reality is the Biden administration, did a great job trying to put a lot of funding and money into trying to get mining and processing of many critical minerals here in the United States. But we understand that the mining and the processing of those minerals will take time. So we consider this as a potential stopgap measure that can help us diversify while we're getting our own industries up and running as well. This MNSEC framework really speaks to Trump's new trade policy executive order, which came out again on his first day of office, where he directs the U.S. Trade Representative to identify countries with which the United States can negotiate agreements on a bilateral or sector-specific basis. So the MNSEC framework is flexible. It can be used for both. So for a bilateral critical minerals agreement, this framework can be used, or on a sector-specific basis if USTR decides to do some sort of critical minerals club. So there is flexibility built into the agreement at all different stages. Now, you might be wondering, why is trade policy at a standstill at the moment for critical minerals? It's such a vital tool. What's going on? So for those not in the trade policy space, I mean, the real reason that it is at a standstill is that there is a block or a disagreement between the executive branch and the legislative branch on who the right partner is, and also the lack of these clear negotiating parameters. Another issue is that there was the expiration of the Trade Promotion Authority. For those not in the trade space, this authority allowed for fast-track negotiations and gave permission for that. So we see it at a standstill. There was one critical mineral agreement that came through. That was the US-Japan critical mineral agreement that gave Japan IRA eligibility. If you look at the agreement, it's about 4 to 5 pages and pretty simple. The United States also looked to open up negotiations for critical mineral agreements with the United Kingdom and the EU, but those have stalled. There was also, the United States was looking at having a critical minerals action plan with Indonesia with a view towards a critical mineral agreement. And there were a lot of concerns with this. And some of those concerns were, most of them were coming from Congress and certain Congress folk. And the congressman said, why should we do a critical mineral agreement with a country that has weaker environmental standards as us? And that was really regarding Indonesia's quote unquote dirty nickel processes. They also raised concerns about Indonesia's labor standards. And another big concern was that there was a lot of Chinese influence in the Indonesia nickel sector, so we should not be entering into an agreement where we are inadvertently benefiting China. And the last concern that was raised by Congress was that if we have critical minerals here at home, we should be incentivizing those industries instead of pursuing a critical mineral agreement or some sort of alliance. So what we did at Silverado, we took all of these factors into account, and we decided to build a framework around these criticisms to break this block between both branches of government. And what you have here is the MNSEC framework. Now, this looks a bit overwhelming, but I just want to walk you through what we did. Is, since we've worked in government, Silverado, we've worked across all 3 trade agencies, so we know how the process is from the inside. So many of the processes here are processes that are already in place. So for example, here at the ITC, there is already a Section 332 process where we can look at mining production, we can look at import, where they can look at import reliance. They can look at what's in a petitioning country, etc. There's also a Section 131 process where ITC can look at, if tariffs are raised, they can look at what the effect will be on tariff reduction or elimination. And if IRA is still in play, that they can look at IRA eligibility as well and model those results. We also know that there's an interagency process that USTR has that can determine, standards in general, but in this case, responsible mining and processing standards. And we borrowed the USTR and congressional consultation from the now expired Trade Promotion Authority, and we put that as a mandatory part of the process because we did hear from the Hill that they want to be consulted on these agreements, so we decided to put it as part of the framework. The only part that would need to, be set up would be at USTR, and that would be the petition process. And I will walk you through that in a bit, but just wanted to show you that what we're doing here is taking what the government already does and putting those pieces together to create a more streamlined, organized process, and have these clear negotiating parameters. And it would also account for stakeholder input as well at various stages of the process. So let's go to the petition process. Having worked at USTR, it's a small agency. We understand that if there's a petition process at USTR, that it would be more organized for these critical mineral agreements. So the petition process could start in two ways. The first way would be for a country to petition USTR to be part of a critical mineral agreement or part of a critical mineral club, or USTR can self-initiate that petition. Now, we understand that if this petition process was open to every single country, that every single country would petition USTR for an agreement. So one way to limit that would be potentially just limit the petition process to mineral security partnership countries. Right now there's 27, so that can be a built-in limitation. And those countries are countries that have already been engaging with the United States on critical minerals. So that's one way to solve that issue. We also know that there's an interagency process. So once a petition is accepted or USTR self-initiates, it would move on to this USTR interagency process on petition approval. And we all know how collegial that process is. That's a joke for anybody that's worked in government. So we can build in objective standards in this process. One tool that can be used is a great tool that the Department of Commerce has now up and running, the new SCALE tool, which assesses mineral by mineral threats in the supply chain and can also potentially give an objective assessment on geopolitical risk. So that can be used. And in this process, if a country petitions for, let's say, 10 critical minerals, there might be some sort of back and forth on limiting the number of minerals in a petition. And if you recall, the US-Japan critical mineral agreements also limited the number of minerals to just battery minerals. Then once the interagency and USTR go through that process, it would go to a USTR-led stakeholder consultation. This is where everybody can come in and have a voice as to whether they approve the petition or whether they think it would harm their industry or harm them. So we've decided to build this in on the forefront just because we think it's important that especially domestic industries have a voice in this process. Next, if USTR decides to accept the petition, weighing all these factors, they would submit a request to the ITC to begin their investigation. Now, at ITC, as I said before, there's two types of investigation. There's a Section 332, which is just a general assessment on critical minerals, the production, the supply chain dynamics, and the foreign influence. And then the Section 131 is almost like an economic effect modeling exercise. And that can be done whether IRA is still on the table or whether there's a tariff component. And it would indicate the harm of entering into agreement on our mineral industry and also downstream industries and all those effects as well. Next, after US ITC does their study, they release a report, and some of that report can be public. So usually a Section 332 is public. There's parts of a 131 that on the economic modeling side that are private, but everyone would see what the report says. For those that don't know, ITC is an independent, quasi-judicial and bipartisan agency. So their economic assessments hold a lot of weight, both on the Hill and in the executive branch, because they're due to their independence. So they would submit this report, everybody would see it, and then USTR can decide based on the analysis of the report whether to proceed with the review or to stop the review at that point. The next part of the process, and this can be done while the ITC process is ongoing, is the interagency and USTR consultation on responsible mining and processing standards, and that can vary by country. For example, there's some countries that have very egregious labor concerns in the mining and processing sector. So this is where the interagency would, hash that out. Next, it would go to USTR and congressional consultation. Again, as I stated, this is borrowed from the expired TPA. And then USTR would certify a decision on whether to enter into the club or a negotiation. So if USTR says yes, there would be a formal negotiation process, but we believe that it would be more streamlined given that the petition country has engaged throughout this process, and there will be a back and forth between USTR and that country throughout this process on these standards, etc. So it should be more streamlined and baked by the time it gets to this standard. If a country is not eligible for a critical mineral agreement or to be part of the club, what USTR can do is develop an action plan. And these action plans can be based on certain standards for the environment in that sector for their country or for labor standards, etc. But what it does is it keeps the petitioning partner country engaged with the United States on critical minerals and helps for the United States to set this global benchmark. And we can give technical assistance or other kind of support to that petitioning country if they don't qualify for a critical mineral agreement. So this engagement would be ongoing. So that wraps up our MinSec framework, but I just want you guys to come away with the fact that it is a flexible framework. It is a framework where there's pieces, again, already that the government does. We're just pulling these pieces together because we really do feel that we need a framework, especially on the trade policy front, in place in order to de-risk from China, especially as we are having more retaliatory actions against China. And these are very, very critical industries that we need to protect here at home. Next, I'm going to turn it over to David for the question and answer part of our session. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Manaz. So while we are waiting on some questions from the audience, please feel free to use that Q&A function that we have in for the Zoom link. But I'll use sort of the moderator's prerogative right now just to start us off with a few as we get started. So one question, sort of as we've been proposing this, as Manaz has been working on this, that we've received, but we think is sort of good to have out there, is that if IRA eligibility is off the table, then why would we do critical mineral agreements with other countries? Why pursue sort of this line of agreement?
Great question, David. I get it all the time. Because we don't know the state of play of IRA eligibility. Actually, I have a slide that I even put in for that. So I think, let's say IRA eligibility is off the table. We still want to engage with our partners, and we can offer a number of carrots in this respect, because we do see that China goes into African countries, South American countries, offers a great package. I know at Silverado, we've done a number of roundtables with P2P strategies where we have a lot of diplomats coming and saying that we want the United States to engage in our countries, and they ask for several things like cooperation on new standards for recycling, innovation, and R&D, as well as technical assistance on these standards. There's an opportunity to get professional funding from MSP, DFC, Exim Bank, and also, driving more investments into their country. So I think that there's still a lot of carrots that we can have besides IRA eligibility to keep ourselves engaged on this front.
Excellent, thank you. Now we do have a question from one of the attendees, and this is a great thing that we've also heard time and time again is, in an ideal world, what would the time frame for this process be with USTR? Sort of ballparking. Oh, perfect. Did you hear that?
Technical difficulties.
I can jump in while Manaz is doing that. I think that the idea is that, we would look to expedite this as fast as possible, and try and keep everything under 1 year. But the benefit of the framework that Manaz lays out is that we are likely going to be having conversations with all of these countries anyway, about how we can work together on supply chain security, on choke points, on non-market practices, on joint investments, and the like. So, while this process is going, it's not like everything is at a standstill and we're not having any other discussions. This would be a framework that exists in parallel with discussions that we would be having anyway. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the time frame, because I think that it would all be sort of leading in a direction of, are we building the case for a deeper, more formal involvement with that particular country? And Manaz, I don't know if you're back now and you want to add, but.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. David, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, absolutely. In an ideal world, what is the time frame for the process with USTR?
I think Sarah laid it out. We're hoping. So the Section 131, usually Andy and I have been through this, and ITC is 4 to 6 months. And then usually a Section 332, it can be anywhere from 9 months to a year and a half. But, I think it would really be up to USTR and ITC to define what those timelines are, but much, much quicker than in a normal negotiation, I believe. And exactly what Sarah said. It would already be baked, our standards.
Excellent. Now we do have a question that sort of merges two components of our critical mineral portfolio when we're sort of dipping our toes into, but one that was laid out here, and that's an attendee is wondering about how circular principles are enacted in partner countries that might have different standards. Standards is a little ambiguous, so different labor, different environmental, different standards in general.
So we didn't lay this out in more detail. And David, we will be writing on circularity and critical mineral agreements.
It will be.
But we didn't get into specifics, but we do think that as part of the critical mineral agreement, that there should be circularity principles driven by the US, and we acknowledge that circularity principles in every country, whether it's a developed or developing country, are very different. So they need to be tailored to that country. And this type of framework allows for that kind of nuance to account for those nuances in circularity as well. Sarah, did you have anything to add on the circularity part?
No, I think that covers it, but it is a very, very critical piece of all of this, and we would expect to see that be part of any discussions that we're having, including any domestic efforts that, we undertake. And I know that there's a lot that's already underway with the companies that are mining here.
Absolutely. Now we have a question sort of going back to the USTR process with timing wise. Man, attendees wondering, have you discussed your sort of the MinSec strategy with USTR and what USTR's reaction is? How likely are they to act on that proposal?
We have talked to a number of folks about this, not in the last month or so since the new team has landed. So we are very excited to meet with folks who are coming in under the Trump administration and speak to them about how we're thinking about this. I will say that we're very encouraged by some of the language in the executive orders that came out last week, as Menaz noted in the presentation. I think that there is definitely going to be a focus, not just by USTR, but by other agencies to figure out how we can create the resiliency that this framework is intended to provide.
Great, great. So now something that a question that we also have and encounter frequently is sort of why particularly these 12 minerals? Why don't we include lithium? Why don't we include cobalt? What happens to sort of the other ones that don't fall within these sort of strategic defense critical minerals as we have them? How does that look for us?
I'm going to give that to Andy.
Thanks, David. So lithium, nickel, cobalt, they're all on the list that we looked at. They're all, of course, used in defense applications, so are critical for defense applications as well as the energy application that we often think about for these minerals. Inherently, when you're creating an index, you have to come up with a list and you have to rank the list. And these minerals are, as we said, we do think are very important. You can find lots of research on lithium on our website. But when we did rank them, I think there's a little smaller share of these minerals that come from the FEOCs, at least directly in the mineral processing stages that we looked at, from the mine process to the refined process to the primary product. And for that reason, they didn't fall quite as high on our ranking in terms of coming up with the top 12 strategic defense critical minerals. But again, we do think these minerals are very important. We have done a lot of research on it, and there'll be more forthcoming on those minerals in the coming year.
And I will just say on the policy side, because some of those critical minerals are not being directly imported to a large degree to the United States, we need different policy recommendations for those. And we put in a recommendation to USTR, potentially using a tool like UFLPA. For that, we would have to first move our supply chains before we impose that. But that would be a different way to get at a problem where we don't see this direct import risk, and that's used in our defense applications. So we are working through that at Silverado as well, trying to group the minerals and then group the policy recommendations based on where we think they are in terms of our exposure risk and their supply chain risk.
Excellent. Yeah, that's definitely a question that we've encountered many times. So this sort of looking at the contemporary climate here, one of the attendees has a question about, and they ask, regarding the use of tariffs as a part of U.S. trade policy, is it likely that tariffs could be imposed on copper imports, even from countries where we have trade agreements, such as they give the examples of Peru and Chile?
I'll take this question. I think it's very likely that we will see more tariffs on a range of critical minerals. I think that what we'll have to do is balance making sure that we are creating a fair playing field on price with those tariffs without necessarily blocking trade in those minerals where we haven't yet developed our own or an alliance alternate supply. So I think it's a little bit tricky, and we're going to have to sort of work on that and work with partners on that very, very closely. But I think that there is a lot that we can be doing with our partners to try and counter some of the non-market and unfair practices in this sector that are leading to market distortions and leading to the price depression in the first place. So tariffs are one part of the problem, but we've got to get to the source and some of the systemic issues with not just government subsidization, but just, the government directed, domination of supply chains that Menaz pointed out earlier. And I think a really great example of this was in the US-Norway critical minerals cooperation agreement that came out just last month, where the two countries have decided that they're going to work on some of these non-market practices for critical minerals in particular. So yes, I think that we will see tariffs, including probably with partners, but I think, we've got to be also working proactively to get to the heart of what is creating the market distortions in the first place.
Great. So now we have a question sort of about, well, offtake agreements. And so they say, great presentation. Thank you for everyone that has sent those kind words. Now they point to the fact that it's critical that private investment in mid-processing happens. That offtake agreements from the US government would assist in encouraging this investment as needed. And then they ask, how can more established and guaranteed offtake agreements be created to encourage investment? I think this sort of runs parallel to some other policy proposals that are floating around out there. I don't know, Sarah, Manaz, Andy, maybe this is within our purview.
Do you want to start? I can add.
Look, I think offtake agreements are definitely going to be, one part of the solution. It depends on the critical mineral and dynamics and, the partners. So I think it's not a one size fits all answer, but it is definitely, part of the solution set. I think one of the things that you see with this presentation is that, what is true for tungsten is, not necessarily true for rare earth. So we need to be really thinking on a mineral by mineral basis. What are the solutions that are going to have, we're going to drive the most investment. And offtakes are going to work for some of these, but not necessarily for others, where you may need a much smaller supply that's not on a commercial scale, such as like lithium would be massive commercial scale needed for many, many projects. So you might have an offtake agreement there, but not necessarily for something like yttrium that is needed in much smaller amounts for very niche end uses.
Excellent. Now we have another question sort of looking at circular principles that I want to pose that an attendee asked. So, and this sort of treats us as a barometer for the policy community. So we'll take everything sort of we say here. So have policy stakeholders considered bolstering domestic recovery and the recycling of critical minerals? They point out that, the disposal and end life stuff, the linear economy extracts these materials, but often ends up disposing them at the end of their life cycles. And they point out that they see countless amounts of disk drives that contain neodymium, magnets, shredded and mixed past the point of currently economical viable processing. Now, how would that sort of be remedied? Would that include subsidies, disposal bans? How does that sort of fit into the contemporary policy stakeholder network right now?
We definitely need to, make this a big pillar of how we're going to be operating domestically and how we're going to be cooperating with partners, as we've already discussed. Circular economy is going to be a huge part of that, and that's going to also mitigate how much you have to actually go to the mine. But I think one of the issues that, it's pretty wonky, so I'm going to lay it out, and I hope that this audience appreciates it. But one of the issues that we see here with end of life is that we don't have a international trading system that has the proper customs nomenclature to support a reverse economy, a reverse supply chain when it comes to critical minerals. So if you look at the way that WCO, the World Customs Organization, lays out the various tariff lines, it is not always clear what is waste or garbage that needs to, be end of life versus what is a viable, recyclable commodity that can be taken out of a laptop or a phone and repurposed and put back into a new item. So we've got a lot of work to do on that. And because it's kind of wonky, it's not something that a lot of people are talking about, but we have written papers on this at Silverado. We've raised this at the World Trade Organization and with a lot of our government partners. And I think that this is something that we need to be thinking very carefully about as we think about what types of incentives are going to exist to really incentivize a circular economy here.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now it looks like that's about all we have in terms of questions. I don't know, Mana, Sarah, Andy, if you have any closing remarks or want to wrap it up with anything.
And I can wrap it up real quick. So as you can see from our webinar today, we have a lot of work to do, and Silverado is looking at this from a trade policy, defense, and other angles. We're still doing a lot of research in this area, and we want you all to stay very engaged with us, especially in this new administration as the dynamics are changing. So I have the slide up. This is our entire team of critical mineral experts, so feel free to email any of us throughout this process. And we look forward to staying engaged with all of you in the coming months. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody, for your attention.